All right, if you're tackling CP1, you already know that none of our work happens in a vacuum. So in this deep dive, we're going to skip the fluff and get right into the nitty-gritty of the economic and commercial environment. We're talking about the real, complex forces you have to master to get the job done right.
So, where do we start? Well, everything comes back to the actuarial control cycle, right? Look, getting a handle on the economic environment, it's not just some box-ticking exercise. It is the foundation. I mean, think about it. If you get this wrong, you can't even specify the problem correctly. You'll misjudge the risks, you won't get what the stakeholders actually need, and you'll end up building your entire solution on, well, on sand. Everything else we do flows from getting this first step absolutely right. Okay, so here's the plan. We're going to start with the big picture, the control cycle, then zoom in on the state and regulation. After that, we'll hit market forces and what's happening inside the providers themselves. Then, the fun part, we'll tackle some past exam questions to see this stuff in action and wrap it all up with a super quick recap and some flashcards.
So let's talk about specifying the problem. You just can't do it without this environmental scan. I mean, imagine a pension fund comes to you and says, we need a de-risking strategy. Okay, simple enough, right? Wrong. The real problem, the one you actually have to solve, is defined by what's happening out there. You've got falling interest rates blowing up their liabilities. You've got new regulations screaming for more capital, and you've got this huge social pressure to make sure investments are ESG compliant. See, the client's request is just the tip of the iceberg. The environment, that's the whole iceberg.
All right, next up, the state and regulation. These are the big macro-level forces you just can't argue with. They are non-negotiable. They set the boundaries, they write the rule book. Basically, they create the entire arena we're all playing in. And at the end of the day, all this regulation is really there for two things: to fix problems in the market and to make sure people can actually trust the financial system.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because you've got this fundamental tug of war between two different ways of doing things. On one hand, you have self-regulation. The pros, it can be fast, flexible, and it's run by people who actually know the market. But the huge risk, and you hear this term all the time, is regulatory capture. That's where the industry is basically policing itself, and you have to wonder if they're putting profits ahead of protecting customers. Then on the other side, you've got statutory regulation. This gives you public confidence, it's independent, but it can be a really blunt, expensive tool. You might get outsiders making rules that just don't make sense for the market's nuances, and that can totally crush innovation.
So what does a regulator actually do all day? Well, you can think of it as this continuous feedback loop. First, they're the gatekeeper, right? They vet companies and people, deciding who gets to play. Once you're in, they become the supervisor. And they're watching two things: your financial health, that's the prudential stuff, and how you treat your customers, that's the conduct side. Now, if someone messes up, the regulator turns into an enforcer, investigating and handing out penalties. And finally, to close the loop, they take everything they've learned from supervising and enforcing and use it to inform the public and advise the government on how to make the rules even better. It's a cycle. Okay, so we've set the stage with the regulatory boundaries. Now let's dive into what happens inside those boundaries. We're talking about the dynamic forces of competition and information. This is kind of the middle ground, the meso level, where the way companies and markets behave create these predictable and often cyclical patterns that as an actuary you just have to have on your radar.
And one of the biggest dynamics you have to master here is the underwriting cycle. Now, this is not some random up and down. It's practically an iron law in any competitive insurance market. It's a classic feedback loop where, get this, the seeds of the next crash are actually planted during the good times. Why? Because high profits attract a flood of new money and new competitors, and what does that do? It inevitably pushes prices down.
So, let's walk through the phases. You start with high profitability. This acts like a magnet for capital. New players jump in, and the fight for market share gets, well, irrational. You see companies deliberately underpricing risk just to write more business. That's your classic soft market. But of course, it can't last. Eventually, those cheap premiums lead to massive, unsustainable losses. The weaker companies either go bust or just get out of that line of business. Suddenly, capital is scarce, and the survivors are in the driver's seat. That's your hard market. They can jack up the rates to profitable levels again, and boom, the whole cycle kicks off all over again.
Another huge market force is information asymmetry. It's basically a fancy way of saying there's a dangerous power imbalance because one side knows more than the other. The one we always think about is the provider knowing more than the customer, which can lead to mis-selling. But it's a two-way street, and it creates massive headaches for the insurer too. You get adverse selection, that's when the people who are most desperate for insurance are the highest risk, precisely because they know something you don't. And then you have moral hazard, that's when people's behavior changes after they're insured. They're not as careful anymore because, hey, they're covered, so they don't bear the full consequences.
All right, so we've looked at the big picture. Now let's zoom all the way into the micro level. How do these huge external forces, regulation, competition, actually shape what goes on inside an individual company? How do these firms actually manage to navigate such a challenging environment?
And that brings us squarely to corporate governance. What is it really? It's the internal rulebook. It's the framework that's supposed to solve that classic principal-agent problem. You've got the stakeholders, the principals, and management, the agents, and the whole point of good governance is to make sure the agents, management, are making decisions that are good for everyone in the long run, shareholders, customers, staff, you name it, and not just making decisions that line their own pockets in the short term.
Now, the key thing to remember is that good governance isn't just some fluffy, abstract concept. It's made real through actual specific mechanisms. For example, a well-designed pay package can get management focused on long-term value. Share options can help with that too. But you have to be careful, because managers usually don't feel the same pain on the downside. But honestly, the real linchpin, the thing that often makes the biggest difference, is the board. Specifically, having independent, non-executive directors who can actually challenge the executive team and provide that critical oversight.
Okay, enough theory. Let's put this knowledge to the test. We're going to deconstruct 3 past exam questions. This is where the rubber really meets the road, moving from just knowing the concepts to actually applying them. We'll focus on the kind of broad, structured thinking the examiners are dying to see when you're under pressure.
All right, first up, a classic application question. A life insurance company is launching an enhanced annuity product. And the question is, discuss the impact of the wider external environments on pricing this thing. The key word here is enhanced annuity, right? So you're immediately thinking about specific mortality factors. But the trick is to connect that back to the wider environment, not just get stuck in the weeds.
You absolutely have to have a structured answer for this. So let's break it down. Economically, interest rates are everything. A tiny shift can have a huge impact on the present value of those long-term liabilities. Demographically, sure, you're pricing for an impaired life, but the real challenge is pricing for the uncertainty of how mortality will improve for that very specific group. Legislatively, don't just say capital requirements, think deeper. Those requirements represent a cost of capital that has to go into the price. And finally, competition. You're not just pricing against other enhanced annuities, you're pricing against every other way someone could get retirement income.
Okay, next question. This one is much more direct. It's a show-me-what-you-know kind of question. List the principal economic influences on bond yields. Pretty simple ask, but breadth is absolutely key here to get all the marks.
But look, for a truly top-tier answer, you can't just list them. You have to explain why. So you'd say, inflation is a big one, because higher expected inflation eats away at the real value of those fixed payments, so yields have to go up to compensate. Short-term interest rates set by the central bank basically anchor the whole yield curve. What about the fiscal deficit? Well, a bigger deficit means the government has to borrow more, which increases the supply of bonds and pushes yields up. Then there's the exchange rate, which affects how attractive your bonds are to overseas investors. You've also got huge institutional cash flows, think pension funds, that can create massive demand and push yields down. And of course, you have to consider how bonds stack up against other investments, like equities.
And for our last question, we're comparing the nuts and bolts of 3 core product types. Describe the principal differences between the benefits under conventional, with profit, without profit, and unit-linked contracts. The absolute heart of this question, the thing you have to nail, is how investment risk is split between the insurance company and the customer in each of these. So it all boils down to one question. Who is carrying the investment risk? With a without-profit contract, it's simple. The insurer takes on 100% of the risk. The customer gets total certainty, and the insurer keeps any upside. With a with-profit contract, it's a shared deal. The policyholder gets a guaranteed minimum, a floor, but they also get a piece of the action through bonuses. Then you have unit-linked. Here, the risk is flipped almost entirely onto the policyholder. They get the full exposure to the market's ups and downs. And this simple difference in risk allocation drives everything else. How you market it, how much capital you need, everything.
Whew. Okay, let's pull all of that together and wrap this up. We're going to do a quick mega recap of the big ideas, and then a super fast flashcard session on those key terms you just have to know. No excuses.
So if you remember anything, remember these 4 pillars that hold this whole topic up. First, the state and its regulations set the playing field. Second, within that field, you have market dynamics, like the underwriting cycle driving behavior. Third, you've got provider governance, which is the internal playbook for each company. And fourth, it all comes down to risk allocation. How products are designed is really all about deciding who takes on which risks.
All right, flashcard time. Let's do this quick. These are the terms you've got to know cold. Systematic risk, the market-wide risk you can't diversify away. Diversifiable risk, the company-specific risk you can. Corporate governance, that's your internal framework for making decisions. The underwriting cycle, the classic boom and bust cycle in insurance. And information asymmetry, that crucial imbalance of knowledge between two parties in a deal. Got it? Good.
And I'll leave you with one final thought to chew on. Everything we've talked about today, all these frameworks, all these cycles, they've all existed in a world with certain technological limits. So my question to you is, how is something like the rise of AI in underwriting, or the use of massive amounts of big data, going to completely blow up these traditional cycles, regulations, and risk models that we've just spent all this time exploring? Because honestly, the answer to that question, that's probably going to define the next chapter for all of us in this profession.